So let's do this one from Richard again. And I say that again, Richard. I'm happy to have any questions, as many as you like. I'm just saying again because it's, I think, your third one. But um, here it is. I'd like to ask something about keying a painting, especially if the subject contains, say, a very reflective, highly colored object well out of the range of paint. Say, a copper plate with a highly colored light area, or even a white object with highlights. Would you paint it as light as possible while retaining some of its color quality and scale down to the darkest dark from that? So anybody who's an impressionist knows that that's actually rather the central question. Um, you have to paint the sun with the yolk of an egg, I think was what Monet said. Uh, and what that basically says is that everything is relational. So you take your most dramatic effect, spot, it typically will be a light effect with a lot of color in it. A strong light effect with a lot of color is the hardest to hit. Um, and you proceed from there. So this is just called anchoring, by the way. And what are the two things we're anchoring for anybody who just hasn't thought this through is you're anchoring the total package of the general impression. In other words, let me do this in an important way. I'm saying that you're actually anchoring to the totality. And I'm saying, secondly, that you're anchoring to a point. And you have to do both. And yet, you can't be sure about your point. I was a little disturbed when I found, I want to say it was Hunt in his writing saying, oh, just pick a color, any color, and then build yourself around some color. And I mean, he sounded like you could really not have striven to try to get the best quality of that effect. And just work with something. And you can. It's just that the guy who puts the time in and does the research. And this whole thing is a search problem, right? Because every time you get in front of nature, it's a whole new phenomenon. It's a whole new set of things that have to hang together. And that relative projection of the one thing over the rest and all the rest, that's just got to be part of it. So what you're finding out, though, is that those are the two fundamental things. How do you get, this really glittery sense of what he calls the brassy thing? When you see a really, really sort of a hot yellow kind of quality of color on a piece of brass, and then you have all sorts of other interesting things in there. How do you get that popped up enough without making the darks too dark? And the answer, of course, is you just give it everything you got. You do everything you can to looking at that point and wondering about what it'll take, as if you could do it by itself. Give it a shot, see what you can get. So when I go around a painting, say this one here, when I go around a painting, I'm actually looking for maybe what would be the leading effect. I want to see what it would take to get that. Maybe it'd be something like right back here. Your job at the beginning, that's why we go around a painting, why an impressionist actually sets notes around and then sets effects up, is because he's doing that kind of research. And I think what Richard may not have quite figured out yet, although maybe he has, is that you have to set up more than one point. So you make a speculation about that brassy reflection of, reflecting the light of the day and those highlights or whatever, and something else. And then you say, okay, so how do where do you compromise? And so you always have in your mind, though, that the big look, the big impression, right? And so I never found it healthy to compromise toward ink, right? And my students will all do that. Maybe we all did do it at a certain point when you really just think it's all about this light effect. You got to get this light effect. Well, the Boston School guys say we don't set up things. We don't darken a painting to get a light effect. We don't let light effects dominate us like that. Well, how can they get away without having the light effects play their whole role? Well, the fact is, there's a continual equilibrium hunted for, right? So you set up, so literally, when Benson says we paint from effects, he actually means we go around and we set up effects. The ones I just described to you in that drawing, we set them up, have a look at them. we put a color next to a color with the right kind of an edge and compare it to the other and the other and the other. And before you know it, you know where you must live. You can adjust this, you can adjust that, you can try this and try that, but you're going to be setting up a range. Well, I don't understand why people choose, by the way, to live in some zone where everything is sort of going to work. I believe in just reaching for the max. I think when you've got a beautiful splash of light and color and all that sort of stuff, this whole thing is just splashing with it. Well, of course, why don't we want that? Why don't we want the uniqueness of this particular moment, this particular day? So that's the modality that you take. And so let me read the question again. Just make sure I haven't. Maybe it'll trigger something I've left out. Keying a painting. So you understand what it is. Keying has two elements. One is anchoring, the way I described it, and the other one is the general tonality of the painting. I mean, you can tell whether the picture ought to be light, dark, middle tone. You can tell whether the general tonality of the painting is X. You try to stay within that. What'll work best. You don't want to paint a sunny day by the effects because you'll get it not a sunny day. Somebody else actually, a question coming up, somebody actually made the claim that that person said they'd heard Ted Seth Jacobs say, and I'm going to talk about that point, that Impressionists paint, they limit they paint way up in key and they don't use darks. Well, if you look at Monet, he's all over the place. He explores all kinds of different things, and you'll find that you can too. You don't have to be limited. I mean, if you said this isn't a dark on here. By the way, this is a copy I did of that Oyster Gatherers, and I copied it with the intention of understanding what his mark making was about, whether he worked the way I work, and I found, of course, that he did precisely, and that's going to be, of course, another video, but you can see that painting, these darks are seriously dark. I mean, these things are pretty close to black. And yet this day doesn't look like it's an inky day, right? That's an Impressionist way. And you can say, well, it's Sargent. Well, it's Sargent, but you'll see those same kinds of notes in many an Impressionist. The problem with using a generalization about Impressionists is it doesn't apply. There's no such thing as it. Those generalizations aren't useful. You'll find these same darks in a Benson. It's almost as if that person hadn't even looked at Benson. And yet the glory of the total impact of a Benson is the sparkle of the day. That's the pleasure of watching his stuff. And yet there's the woman standing out against the sky. It's all sky and woman and light and sun and sky. Yeah, there aren't too many very darks in there. In fact, there may not be any. In fact, that's actually kind of what this one is, kind of a peek at the day of a woman in front of a very light day, very light sky, very light ground. All that it looks like to you if you're first bouncing it is she's a white painting and she's a dark. It doesn't mean you have to paint it enormously dark, but that's where you can set the range, though. You can choose to set it, and you should experiment with that. You should experiment with setting, try it with see what it takes if you make that blue of that dress lighter, and then try to make the totality of the general impression do the same thing. You further limit yourself when you do that because the effects, for example, at edge, where you get this glorious effect just in this spot here with this glow of light out of the sky in the background. You get those effects partially by values, partially by edge, and partially by chroma. And you're searching, you go hunt for them. But the totality is an impactful thing. So the totality of the effect, it's a dark, lighter, middle tone painting, is going to have a role to play. I suggest you look out a window like this one right here. If you stand out there you'll see darks in the woods. You'll see really seriously darks and really huge contrasts on a sunny day. But if you look through this window where these darks all around us make the whole thing light, you'll understand how an Impressionist might conclude that or at least set himself up to paint a painting and see if he could be successful in a really shallow value range. Because with these darks here setting the dark for us, and this light effect, of the whole window to the dark, creating a first blast, you could actually say that was worth exploring. Let's find out then if I can actually make this thing do all the things it does within that really now reduced value range. It's forced on you by the general impact of the window, everything coming through the window simultaneously being light. But Yeah, Richard, but that's the discussion really. It's how do you? It's really about setting up a variety of 2 and 3 and 4 different effects. So when Benson says we paint from effects, take him seriously. Paint the effects, and he also says we draw from effects. He says specifically to his daughter, draw with the effects. Stop drawing outlines the way you've been taught. Draw. And by the way, she went to the museum school, if I'm not mistaken, initially. But he said draw with the effects. So the effects actually, now that's a whole other video, but the effects are actually setting up the entire placement of everything on the page. And yeah, I better stop at that. But there's a very, very interesting discussion that follows up on how that game works. And it's already down the row here a little bit further. So with that, I think I'll just stop there, Richard. I want you to ask again if I wasn't nailing it, but or if you don't understand it, okay? Anyway, but thank you all for your time here today. Please do subscribe, share for sure, like, and ask more questions. Bring more comments and questions, and see you next time. Thanks a lot.